Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of A Good Run with Daniel Feldman. I'm Leah Feldman, Dan Feldman's daughter. We are going to start this podcast today talking with Dan about a particular sect of political history that he refers to as the Reformers and the Regulars, and how those two political sways might reflect a little bit of what's going on in current politics today.
So, hey, it's Asher Feldman. I'm here with Leah. Is there anything in particular that you kind of keyed in on or anything that kind of struck you as interesting in reflecting how his experience way back then reflects on today's political spectrum?
I think what was the most interesting was the concept that without people who push reform, without a really strong progressive sentiment, at least somewhere amidst the political spectrum, it's kind of impossible to have political progress, even if it's not what the reformers set out to accomplish in their, conceptually. There has to be some kind of wheel turning in order to make any kind of political change happen. It's sort of what we focused on when we were, discussing and contrasting the concept of a reformer with a regular, and how that might play into modern day politics and past politics.
Sounds fascinating. Yeah. Interested to listen.
Yeah, it was great. So hope you enjoy this episode of A Good Run, and we'll see you next week. Of A Good Run with Daniel Feldman, our author and interviewee. I'm Leah Feldman. There is a relationship. I am Dan Feldman's daughter, and I will be asking him some questions about his second blog post that we'll be discussing today. Basically on the subject of reformers and regulars. So the difference between someone who maintains the establishment and those who try to introduce new concepts, right? More or less?
More or less.
Okay. Okay. So in the first paragraph, in your opening paragraph of this blog post, you refer to yourself as a loyal product of that movement, the movement of the reformers.
Right.
Do you mind giving us a little background on that?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I know where to begin exactly, but I guess the reform movement in democratic politics, arguably, to my knowledge, I think it began around 1956. I know from my personal experience, the regular Democratic organization in the Rockaways where I grew up was not interested in supporting the Democratic candidate for president, Adlai Stevenson, because they thought for sure Eisenhower would win, which he did, naturally, and they didn't want to jeopardize the political careers of their local politicians by tying them too closely to Stevenson. Very much like the way some Republican candidates today don't want to get too close to Donald Trump because they're afraid he might make them lose. But the difference was that Stevenson was an admirable person. I mean, an intellectual, honest, brilliant guy. So in 52, I think, when Stevenson ran the first time against Eisenhower, I think they did campaign for him. But in 56, they basically refused to do so. My mother had been what you call a captain in the regular organization. That is, she was the person who rang the doorbells and got the petition signatures and did all the day-to-day work to keep the organization running. And when the organization said, we're really not going to, we don't want to get too close to Adlai Stevenson, my mother said, that's very interesting. And she created the Reformed Democratic Club of the Rockaways, which exists to this day, and campaigned for Stevenson. By the way, the people they were running were later indicted. I mean, they were a bunch of creeps, basically. But that was the organization. So the reform movement, I think, what my mother was one of many, many people. Eleanor Roosevelt was very involved at this point. I'm trying to remember some of the other big names. But so the reform movement began. You began to get Reformed Democratic clubs, I think in 56 for the most part. but there was a big expansion in '68. The Coalition for Democratic Alternatives, the New Democratic Coalition, these were reform clubs that were, many of whose members were motivated by opposition to the Vietnam War. Because, of course, at that point, you had Lyndon Johnson, who was a Democratic president, and the establishment supporting the war. And so the reform movement was energized, and a lot more people joined, motivated by opposition to the Vietnam War. And so between my family experience in the 50s and my own experience in the 60s, clearly these were formative influences on me, and I am very much, and still to this day, consider myself part of that movement.
That makes a lot of sense. There are obviously strong family ties, and as a member of said family, I sort of hesitate to ask, but there is you talk a lot about Francis Berry and his book, The Scandal of Reform, in this post. Right. And you sort of explain the tenor of the title to be less than favorable in terms of the reform movement. Right. And you later don't completely reject that concept. You agree that there are some instances of scandal in the reform movement.
Well, yes. I mean, he doesn't. He's not using scandal in the sense that we usually use it today. He's not talking about people stealing money or that sort of thing. He means that the scandal he's referring to is how ineffectual or sometimes counterproductive the efforts of reformers have been. Of course, there is some merit to what he says. Overall, I don't agree with it, but there is some merit to it. Perhaps this is a time for me to read the Boss Croker quotation. There's a New York City Tammany Hall politician back in the late 19th century who gave a fairly eloquent, I think, explanation of why regulars and people like what's the author's name again?
Barry.
Like Frank Barry are somewhat skeptical of the role of reformers. Croker said he was talking about what he calls mugwumps, which of course we mean the reform types. He also calls them silk stockings. He said these are most of these people will very rarely get involved in political work at all. I mean, when I talked earlier about going door to door with petitions and getting petition signatures and getting the vote out and the day-to-day interactions that make a political captain influential with his or her community, that's work, and it takes a lot of time and effort. And Croker was saying the reform types, the mugwumps, that sort of citizen, he says, quote, why is it that the minority of cultured, leisured citizens will not touch political work? No, not with their little finger. All your high principles will not induce a mugwump to take more than a fitful interest in an occasional election. He goes on to say, why, when mugwump principles won't even make mugwumps work, do you expect the same lofty motives to be sufficient to interest the masses in politics? And so we need to bribe them with spoils. Spoils vary in different countries. Here they take the shape of offices. Of course, what Croker was saying was, people get involved in regular politics to advance themselves, to get jobs, favors, and so on and so forth. And he makes a fair point. I mean, the Vietnam War brought us out in large numbers into the reform club, but for most people, that didn't, when that issue passed, their involvement passed. They weren't willing to do that day-to-day, year in and year out work in politics. And the other thing is that, in retrospect, we reformers like myself, we in fact did reduce the power of, I'm going to say, let me explain that further. I was about to say we did reduce the power of the regular organization of politics. It wasn't just us. The New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt, anything that made poor people, for the most part, less dependent on favors from the political club and more entitled to benefits like welfare and Social Security and so on and so forth as a matter of law, or jobs as a matter of merit, civil service, merit examinations. These are all reform principles and goals over the years. And so they did reduce the power of the regular organization. And while I still think on balance that was probably a good thing, I have to admit that if a fellow like Donald Trump had gone to any political bosses, when political bosses reigned supreme, there's no way they ever would have gone with a fellow like that for public office. They did provide at least some measure of screening out of totally incompetent and obnoxious and scrupulous fellows. And occasionally, they even produced a really outstanding figure like Al Smith, who was clearly a product of Tammany Hall and who was governor of New York in the 1920s, and in my view and view of many other political and historical scholars, was the best governor New York ever had. Al Smith was a man with not even a high school education who was incredibly poor as a kid, and whose work as governor of New York in many ways formed the model for Roosevelt's New Deal, whose clear priority was to improve the lives of poor and working people, and he did so. And so, to the extent that the end of the regular club meant even more domination by people, by big money, by people with access to big money, and away from people like Al Smith. That was unfortunate, and to the extent that Francis Barry would make that argument, I suppose I have to agree with him.
What do you think? I was actually about to ask you about Al Smith, because he seems to escape a lot of the concepts that you put forth about regular politicians. Yeah. And I wonder what it is about the canter of his work that allows him to differentiate himself from that concept.
A number of prominent politicians start their careers intending to, someday accumulate enough power to do something good, but meanwhile make all the deals they have to make. But I think by and large, for most of them, those ideals fall by the wayside by the time they do accumulate any significant power. In Al Smith's case, that just wasn't the case. He kept to his ideals. Actually, Tammany Hall itself may have been at its best at that point, because when he became governor, he asked the leader of Tammany, I don't remember who it was, I no longer remember the name, but he asked the leader of Tammany Hall at the time, what do you want from me as governor? And they said, be a good governor. So now, there may have been some self-interest there too, because that obviously would legitimate Tammany Hall and the Democratic Party to some extent, and would maybe let them, continue to steal on a local level thereafter, for all we know. And certainly Jimmy Walker and other Tammany politicians who became mayor. Jimmy Walker was the mayor of New York City, and others such did in fact continue to do outrageous things. But Smith himself absolutely kept to his ideals and was. Not only as governor, actually, even when he was a member of the assembly, he was the champion of poor and working people in the state of New York.
Well, it sounds like it's possible then for folks who do have enough of a sense of righteousness involved. There can be folks. I was curious about what you would have thought if is it possible for people who maintain the sort of status quo without the concept of the reformer? Is it possible to maintain progress in a political party or in any kind of political structure without people who are true outliers, people who come in with really brand new reformative concepts? Do you think it would be possible to maintain a political machine without these, really far off the beaten track folks who provide very different concepts?
That's a good question. It reminds me a little, for anybody who's a Downton Abbey fan, at a certain point, the Dowager, when faced with the need to accept the young left-wing Irish son-in-law's position in the family, said, the aristocracy hasn't stayed in power for all these generations without being able to adjust. Right. and I think in a sense, I suppose you could say that the regular organization and the reformers have in a way some kind of symbiotic relationship. I guess that is what you're saying.
Yeah.
In that,
can one exist without the other?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I mean, people like Norman Thomas, who was the socialist candidate for president of the United States, way before Al Smith, was pushing for things like Social Security and so forth, which the Democrats under Smith and Roosevelt ultimately, and even Republicans, eventually Eisenhower, embraced ultimately. I was just thinking of Stanley Fink, who I'll talk about in later podcasts. But Stanley was very much a product of the regular machine out of Meade Esposito's club in Canarsie in Brooklyn. And of course, the public at large has no idea who Stanley Fink was. But for those of us who worked with him, he was at least as admirable a figure as Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama, more than Bill Clinton, et cetera, et cetera. A brilliant, very progressive, very principled man who was the leader of the Democratic leader of the New York State Assembly for a number of years. And he was a regular, definitely not a reformer, but he would accept and incorporate and implement ideas that the reformers brought to him. Mm-hmm. So I think, does that answer your question?
Well, I guess what the concept I got from that was that someone like Stanley Fink can be a regular and can be a respectable figure. Mm-hmm. However, his respectability comes a bit from his willingness to incorporate reform ideas.
Yeah, well, at least from the perspective of people like me, yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay.
I guess there are some people who don't care about that, and they still respect him. But,
right.
But Stanley won the respect of people with reformers because he not only accepted many of our ideas. He came up with some of them himself, right. And was an incredibly effective leader in that regard.
This sort of leads me to a question a bit more present day than your post sort of talks about, but I'm curious about the concept of a reformer and a regular in today's political climate. It's basically on everyone's minds. There are people who now are running for office that fully embody those two concepts, I would say. I think that they now maybe more than any election we've had in recent history.
Are you talking about Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton?
I am. Yeah. And also Donald Trump.
Yeah.
These are people who are staunchly advocates of their concept of either maintaining the status quo, maybe not, in those words, or fully uprighting it.
You just made a point that has thrown me for a loop, because you're right. In a sense, Donald Trump is, I guess, a reformer.
Yeah.
That is a horrifying notion for me, because that's not reform as I know it.
However,
but I guess from the perspective of his supporters, he's a reformer. To me, somebody who supports dictators and has dictatorial tendencies himself, I really just can't fit that into my notion of a reformer. Now, Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, that's how, clearly I think of him more as a reform type, and a legitimate reform type. Not that we agree on everything, but actually, Ed Koch once said, he said, if you agree with me on only 2 out of 10 things, you should vote for someone else. If you agree with me on 8 out of 10 things, 7 out of 10 things, you should vote for me. If you agree with me on 10 out of 10 things, you should see a psychiatrist. So I don't have to agree with Bernie entirely to consider him within the fold. So.
A lot of these stories and the things that you talk about in your blog are interesting on their own merit, but also because they, history repeats itself. And it's very interesting and almost a shame a bit that people don't have the political history to know where these figures today are coming from. The concept of, what is a reformer, what is a regular, has been around for so long. And, it's, I think, an integral part of any political choice that you make.
Even Boss Croker's comment is very relevant, because the big question is, will the Sanders people remain a force in politics, or will they fade away as this year's campaign ends? They can be motivated, if they are motivated, to remain a force in American politics. That would be great. I think there's some reason to hope that they may, because just as the Vietnam War, or opposition to the Vietnam War, motivated people to remain involved in politics for a number of years, I think the very serious issues, particularly of inequality, facing Americans today, may provide sufficient motivation for these people to stay in active politics, and that would be great.
Yeah. Do you think that a reform like Bernie Sanders would have on a campaign like Hillary's? It's sort of my question, similar to my question before about in this symbiotic relationship between reformers and regulars, can one exist without the other? What is the effect of a reformer on a regular?
Well, if the Sanders people remain active, then they will be able to hold or influence Hillary to keep to the commitments she appears to have made in the Democratic platform negotiations. So that if she understands that a sizable political force insists on truly progressive policies, that will obviously make it easier for her to stay true to those policies. And I think that's vitally important.
I am curious, this is maybe a slightly more personal question. There are, throughout the blog, references to your reader. Mm-hmm. And so, in particular, I'm interested, you refer at sort of the end of the post that you're writing the comments not to dissuade the reader from any of their own concepts, but simply to, provide perspective from where the rest of the stories are coming from. Provide them with a background so that they can understand where your political compass landed. Right. So I'm curious about, when you write these blog posts and even for this podcast, what is it that you are trying to communicate to the reader, and what kind of message do you hope the reader takes away?
I guess I had a number of different hopes for the blog posts, and then now for this podcast. One is that I will be going in future podcasts. We will be going into some history that might otherwise be lost, because I had some experiences that were my experiences in politics, and that if people don't hear about them, they won't know about them, and they are relevant. I think they may help people understand the nature of politics. Secondly, there's some just good stories that I think people that are, I originally wrote these things not for educational purposes, but for entertainment purposes. And I hope people find them interesting. But beyond that, as you suggested earlier, like people say history repeats itself, but the first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. But leaving that aside, I think although issues change and dramatis personae change, the actors change, there are things about politics, because they are really about human nature, that don't change and that remain applicable. And so I think the stories that I will tell, I think, may be helpful and illuminating to people. Certainly if they're actively involved in politics, but even if they're just observers, to help people understand better what's going on.
It's a great answer, and I do feel a necessity to add that as your daughter, and as someone who only recently came to a more politically active existence, the nature of human philosophy and behavior that exists within politics, surprising bit. And it becomes a little more like reading a story, or having a real connection to the people behind these sort of masks that a lot of these political figures take on, and it can really help inform someone as a voter, me as a voter. So I think for my final question, again going back to the blog post, it's sort of you use the word philosophical as to describe the descendants of some of these reformers. And they're both their, actual descendants and their philosophical descendants, and how they may help, bring with them things from the American Labor Party and people who were around during the New Deal, like how they have managed to become a descendant of this and influence the current structure. I wonder what you mean really by the philosophical descendants, where, and also, the descendants themselves.
Well, obviously, I'm a descendant of my mother.
Right.
Actually, go back another generation or two. My mother's father was a charter member of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Which when he was a charter member around the turn of the last century, or 1900 or so, was a strong political statement, and took some courage too, because those were the days when strikebreakers were breaking heads. I mean, so and then I think on both sides of the family, my ancestors were, it's, the old line was, is it good for the Jews and the working people? That was the litmus test. So I'm, of course, a literal descendant, but philosophically, it's often said, with some merit, that take the word liberal. It doesn't mean the same thing today that it meant in the 19th century. It probably doesn't mean this. It surely doesn't mean the same thing today that it meant in the mid 20th century. However, I think there are some themes, some philosophical themes that persist. Actually, to me, Morris Raphael Cohen, who was a legendary teacher at City University in the 1930s, defined liberalism as a willingness to re-examine one's views at any time in light of newly available evidence. Certainly when you have a segment of the electorate today that's not willing to even acknowledge evidence of things, that is not liberal. And so one can define oneself in opposition to that. I have to think also that there's a certain optimism about humanity that informs the kind of liberalism I'm talking about. If you are terminally cynical, then I don't think you can really be liberal. At the same time, you have to be skeptical. I mean, certainly skeptical of power. And at least my kind of liberalism is skeptical of government power as well as private power. The right often accuses the left today of being entirely enthralled to government. I don't think that's fair. At least it's not a fair description of me, for sure. I believe one should remain skeptical of the private sector and the public sector. And I think that skepticism but openness to evidence, I think, are two essential elements of the kind of liberal philosophy I'm talking about.
Well, thank you very much for all of your insightful words, and these posts are full of really important stories, I would say, to today's political-minded population. I think that's going to conclude for today. Please continue to stay posted for future blog posts and future podcasts with Dan Feldman and maybe myself. Also, my brother Asher will also be conducting some of these interviews. It's a family affair. But thank you for listening to A Good Run, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.